quite a volatile situation here in Kraaifontein at the moment. Hordes and hordes of angry protesters. Of course, the situation with regards to land, illegal land occupations have been ongoing in areas such as Kraaifontein. And of course, we understand that there's been some looting that has taken place inside the premises of the raceway as well.
If you've lived in Cape Town long enough, you've probably heard of Tygerberg Raceway. It wasn't just a motorsport track, it was a home, a community, and for many, a lifestyle. But in July 2020, that all changed when land invaders swarmed the track and leveled it to the ground in just a few days. This documentary sets out to uncover how something like this could happen. Not just here, but across South Africa. Who's enabling it? Who's profiting? And why does the law seem powerless to stop it? To understand this story, we start from the beginning with the man who built it all, Chris Liebenberg, the former owner of the Tygerberg Raceway.
Chris Liebenberg. I was the owner of Tygerberg Raceway. Dis 'n baie lang storie en eintlik 'n baie tragiese storie. Ek dink die 25ste Julie 2020 dat ons nog 'n practice daar by die baan. En terwyl ons besig was met die practice, het ons gehoor maar hier in die buitekant van die baan is chaos in die gang. Ek het aan my voertuig geklim. Toe ry ek by die baan uit, want ons het op die infield van die baan gesit. En die practice nog gedoen met al die karre binne in die baan. Toe ry ek buitekant uit om te gaan kyk, en toe ek buitekant kom, toe sien ek maar, daar is 'n oop stuk veld gewees aan die een kant van die baan. Toe sien ek maar, hulle is nou besig om plakkershitte daar op te rig, en dit slat, dis ook om die sinkplate wat hulle so slaan by die hamers nog goed klink, die geraas nie goed. Maar nou, ek het my nie veel daar gesteer nie, want dit het al baie gebeur, en dan die law enforcement gekom, en hulle maar verwyder, die naweek na die 26ste. Toe bel my manager of my toesighouer vir my daar, van die baan, en sê ek moet kom, hier is groot probleme hier. Nou ja, toe ek nou deurjaag soontoe, ek nou daar kom, toe is die hele pad afgeblenk, en dis net law enforcement mense, en ons kan nie deurgaan na die plek toe nie. Toe sê ek vir hulle, maar ek gaan deur, is my property daar, ek moet die plek gaan beskerm. Toe is die mense al besig om die vibrate fencing, wat om die plek is, te begin platstoot. Ja, ek is uit die aard van die saak nou nie 'n verskriklike bang man nie. Toe jaag ek tot daar by hulle, maar dis hordes swart mense. Die praat seker van 1500 na 2000 toe maklik. En toe gaan vra ek hulle, maar hoekom breek hulle die plek af? Wat is hier in die gang? En toe bel ek die polisie. Brigadier Gerda van Niekerk. Haar heel eerste woorde in my was, ek moet die city aankla. Haar heel eerste woorde. Sy het niks enigiets verder my gevra nie. Ek wou nog vra, Gerda, wat gaan aan? Toe sê sy vir my, maar ek moet die city dagvaar. Toe vra ek, hoekom? Toe sê sy, hoe dit blikbaar werk is die law enforcement kom om mense te verwyder, of plakkershuise te verwyder, dan moet die polisie beskerming gee. En hulle het vir law enforcement gesê, hulle kan dit nie doen uit dagie, want sy het nie vir hulle beskerming, so hulle kan nie kom nie. So daar was die beskerming vir law enforcement nie. So wat gebeur het is, law enforcement het toe ingebeweeg, en begin die huise afbreek, wat hulle normaalweg doen. Die verskil is nie, daar was die polisie beskerming nie. Want law enforcement breek af, hulle is nie beskermingseenheid, hulle is die eenheid wat afbreek. So, toe die mense nou begin aanval, toe is hulle te swak, law enforcement. Toe onttrek law enforcement. Nou ja, wat is die eerste teken? Die eerste teken is nou my plek. Toe teken die community of die mense nou daar my perseel. En hulle begin breek my perseel af. Bekend is met die swart areas en die plakkerskampe en goed. Ek is nou redelik baie bekend met hulle. En hulle het oral maar hierdie gangster type leaders en community leaders and all that type of people there. So I must get them involved to help save the place for me. So ja, ek het daai week vir hulle ingeroep. Hulle die week, it cost me a lot of money. I think about 200,000 rand for the week for security of that week. But you can't stop them. Je kan nie. Hoe stop je 1000, 2000 mense? So, dit was 'n helse storie geweest. Op een van die dag het ons dan vier van ons mense wat by ons betrokke was, met hulle voertuie daar gekry om my te help, want dis toe 'n geskietery en ek bedoel die gangsters skiet En ons skiet om te keer, ek moet my property beskerm. Die polisie is daar nie, die law enforcement onttrek. So, dit was amper so Skelby en Kroeks, net sonder pere. Lang storie kort te maak, dit was ewige aanvalle geweest. Regtig, ek praat van maklik 1500, 2000 mense wat op jou afstorm. Ek bedoel, as ek in die voertuie was, het hulle ons doodgemaak. En die ding het 'n bietjie, ons het hom so 'n bietjie gekalmeer. Die polisie het seker so ek skat so na 3-4 ure dat hulle daar aangekom en vir ons begin 'n ondersteuning gee. So, die dinge toe redelik gekalmeer, maar die hele week het die ding maar aangegaan. Elke dag kom hulle terug, ek kom breek hulle nog dit af en hulle kom breek dat af. Ek bedoel, albei voertuie wat jy hier sien, het daar gestaan. Plus al my implemente, my trekkers, my waterlorries, my padskrapers, alles wat om 'n hele racetrek te behartig was daar. En die mense is besig om hulle af te brand. Hulle het een van my waterlorries afgebrand, een van die trekkers afgebrand, al my quadbikes wat daar was is afgebrand. VIP losies, community halls, gone, toilets, gone. Intussen kon ons deur die week dan die movable goed verwyder het. Maar die volgende Saterdag was daai plek so gelyk soos hierdie grond. The complete racetrack is gone. In a week, everything to the ground. I lost about 60 million rand there. To build a place like that, to build a racetrack with all the facilities. That was a farm. It was an open farmland when we get there in 1994. There was nothing. Everything what stays there is not coming from the city. Coming out of our pockets. The spinning community come to me. They spin illegal all over Cape Town because there was no legal ground for them to do. And I said to them, all right, let's see what we can do. So I built a spinning pitch. It cost me about 5 million rand. 1 year, it's gone. So it was the only legal spinning pitch in Cape Town, and the best. I put up the biggest show ever in Cape Town of spinning in that place. They will come and tell you what I do for the sport. They also phone me every day. Please, Mr. Chris, come, build us a proper, because they're spinning pitch now in Kilani, but they don't want it. It's not what they want. So to build this racetrack, to replace that, it will cost you 70, 80 million. That's the sum you make. But myself, I lost about 60 million. But it says in the agreement, in the contract, they must pay me back. When the lease is gone, and they want me to move out there, they must pay me back every cent I put in there. I go afterwards, and because we need another place. And the city makes me a lot of promises. Like JP Smith, if he wants to go back to his stuff that he said on the radio and on the TV, he said they must give me my stuff back and they must help me and all that shit. But nothing happens. Some of the DA councillors, I think, comes to me, I think that was just to keep me quiet from the media. And when the dust is gone, nothing happens. It's now 5 years. So they come and they get me in the cars and drive me all along Cape Town to show me where's another ground to build racetracks and all that. But 5 years later, where's it? Where's the promises? The land was marked for housing, and they can't build there. There's no way they can build there. The water level is too high. If you dig less than half a meter, you're in the water. The water was running over the track. So the city knows very well. I make a lot of stuff away from the city that they didn't even know. Because most people in the city sit in the offices and they don't know what's going in the ground. So they come there and I show them everything. I spent millions of rands in that racetrack just to get the water away. I take the whole old racetrack away, put draining pipes in around the track to the outside road, to the road outside, municipality water drains. So yeah, I spent a lot of money there to make it really the best racetrack in South Africa.
Nou, in daai hele week wat gevolg het en jy die ding sien afspeel en al hoe erger raak, wat het deur jou kop gegaan, wat het in jou hart gebeur?
Kom ons praat hieroor. Jy weet, die plek wat ek verloor het, ons ek weg van my lewe. Dit was scary, mense besef nie wat ons deurgemaak het. Maar ek wil nie baie graag daaroor praat nie. Dit is net hartseer. Dit is nie maklik nie. Dat ek lewe dag en nag vir racing. Ek dink nie daar is 'n persoon in Suid-Afrika wat gedoen het vir die racing community wat ek gedoen het. Ek glo dit. In Suid-Afrika is daar 'n man wat gedoen het vir racing wat ek gedoen het.
This is what the racetrack has become. But how did we get here? Why did law enforcement, the courts, the entire system fail? To find answers, I reached out to the city, specifically the Informal Settlements Department. They referred me to the city's media team, who chose to respond via email. One of the questions that I asked them was about the compensation clause in the contract that Chris was talking about. Here's what they had to say. That is incorrect. Clause 20 specifies that no compensation shall be payable for any improvements made by the lessee. They attached a clause that boils down to this. After 20 years of tenancy, the landlord owes the tenant nothing for improvements. Chris took control of the racetrack in 1994. By the time 2014 came around, that clause is in effect. But in 2016, the city reached out to Chris and started a conversation about renewing the lease. But shortly after this, the city just went quiet and no renewal was signed. Chris was kind enough to share his lease agreement with me. I saw the clauses about reimbursements, but one clause stood out. Clause 9. It says, the lessee must keep the property in good condition and take all reasonable steps to prevent unlawful structures or occupation. Any damage or occupation resulting from failure to do so must be fixed at the lessee's cost. In simple terms, Chris was responsible for protecting the land, not just maintaining it, but preventing land invasions. And if he failed, he'd have to pay. The city would not reimburse or compensate. But when 2,000 people invaded, law enforcement, SAPs, and the city couldn't stop them. So I ask, what exactly was Chris supposed to do? Fight off an entire settlement by himself? When the full force of the law couldn't protect this land, how could one man possibly be expected to? If the city couldn't do it, how on earth was Chris meant to? I needed to find out how or why the city failed to protect the raceway. The city wouldn't meet me in person, but JP Smith did.
JP Smith, I'm the Mayoral Committee Member for Safety and Security for the City of Cape Town. So there was a gradual process of land invasions around the area for a while prior to Tygerberg Raceway. It happened during the fever pitch of the COVID lockdown. A number of factors had come together during that stage to create a unique paralysis against defending land against land invaders. The specific problem occurred during July and started with vandalism of the raceway's walls and fencing. The city responded to that crisis. We were dealing with as many at the time as 12 land invasions per day in 30 hotspots around the city. The land invaders had us running from pillar to post trying to defend. The attack on the Tygerberg Raceway was probably the most violent. Day after day, our staff went in with hardened vehicles. They had an assembly point further down the road at the one large traffic circle. I think they're on Marula Road, and they would move on up and try and demolish the structures as they were going up. And in that particular land invasion, the land invaders subjected one of our staff, or attacked one of our staff members with a petrol bomb, which they chucked on the staff member inside a vehicle. We also during that time started seeing for the first time live rounds of ammunition being discharged at us. So not just organically people expanding structures and building the next structure, etc., but large orchestrated land invasions with large amounts of building materials being delivered by trucks orchestrated attacks on city staff, women and children being placed in front of the land invasions to make it impossible for our staff to respond. And because of the broken nature of the legislation involved, the PI Act, and I talked about these other compounding factors, the COVID disaster management lockdown regulations, which said we couldn't demolish any structures, and we could not, no eviction applications could take place. So the courts weren't processing any of these interdict applications or eviction applications. And compounded by the South African Human Rights Commission, Chris Liebenberg's court action against the city, which I'm fairly confident he did not himself believe in, based on the comments he made to us in the mayoral committee and in the engagements with the then mayor. But here one needs to understand how broken and farcical the legislation is. So during that time, because of the SAHRC court interdict and because of the lockdown regulations, and because of the body of legislation and how the goalposts have moved with the PI Act and the interpretation of that very vague piece of legislation by judges and courts across South Africa.
Pause. Wait a second. What's this PI Act that everyone keeps mentioning? If it's the first time you're hearing about it, you're not alone. Luckily, I know a guy who can break it all down. Mark Oppenheimer.
The Prevention of Illegal Eviction from an Unlawful Occupation of Land Act, otherwise known as PI, is the primary legislation for regulating evictions in South Africa. This will be a hurdle for any person who owns land and wants to evict illegal occupiers from it. And this would, of course, have been the legislation that would have governed the situation that the racetrack found itself in. So the purpose of the PI Act is to provide protections for people who illegally occupy land or buildings, and to then provide a process for their eviction. So it makes it illegal to evict someone without going through a court process. It also makes it illegal and punishable with a jail sentence to hijack a building and then sell access to that building to illegal occupiers. But what it does in creating these different procedural constraints in terms of how an eviction must operate is to delay the eviction process and to add to the costs. So it's incredibly expensive to have someone evicted, and it can be incredibly time consuming to have someone evicted. And so what that does is erode a property rights owner's use of their property. One of the ways in which PI often comes up in our courts is when you have someone who is a tenant, they entered into a lease, they paid for a certain period of time, and then at some juncture they stopped paying. Once they stopped paying, they became an illegal occupier in terms of the Act. This is something that probably wasn't envisaged by the original drafters, but was developed through the case law. What it then does is create this very expensive burden to have the person removed, and doesn't allow someone to take the law into their own hands and to evict the person themselves at pain of criminal sanction. What happens in practice is that it can cost hundreds of thousands of rands to conduct an eviction, which must be done through the sheriff, and long delays in court processes and the expense of hiring lawyers, often under circumstances where it's impossible to recover the costs.
Many South Africans don't know that this law exists. The PI Act was introduced in 1998 as a response to apartheid's legacy of forced removals, meant to ensure that those injustices would never happen again. At its core, it was about protecting dignity, fairness, and justice in a new South Africa.
Because effectively what the PI Act does now, and as it is now most recently interpreted, is to say that that we may only demolish the structures if we do it instantaneously. So the Human Rights Commission got an interdict application against us to prevent us from counter-spoliating.
Hold on, counter-spoliating? What does that even mean? Let's go to Mark.
One method that someone can use to quickly reclaim land that has been illegally occupied is called counter-spoliation. So let's say that you're walking down the street and someone grabs your handbag. You are allowed to immediately grab it back from them. That's sort of counter-spoliation. But if you waited a month or two to then try and reclaim your handbag and then took it from them, you would be spoliating the handbag from them. And they would have a claim to say, I'm in possession of the item. The ownership is not a concern, but you have to have a court order to get it back from you. You can't just take the law into your own hands. So it must be done immediately.
you effectively have a situation where only if we are instantaneously stopping the structure may we act. Where we have acted in the court's estimation, anywhere after that, we have been forced to return the building materials, rebuild the structures, and pay compensation to the persons. The PI Act is a very skinny framework piece of legislation. It is meant to be populated or underpinned by regulations that are supposed to flesh out the detail of it. Because national government have, since the inception of our democratic dispensation, failed to flesh out those regulations, we have a completely broken piece of law that effectively says if you leave your home, you return and you find somebody has now hopped over your low boundary fence and opened a tent on your front lawn, that structure is permanent. It's there. It's a home. It's deemed a home in the court. Even the piece of plastic that a homeless person pulls over him or herself is deemed a home. We then went to court, and it took an incredible long time for the courts to permit us to challenge that extremely problematic SAHRC court interdict that precluded us from exercising that common law right of counter-spoliation. And eventually we won. We went to court, and I think it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Appeals. The court said we are allowed to counter-spoliate. We are allowed to hire contractors, because they also try to block us from using contracted services to remove the structures. We are allowed to have a land invasion unit, which they also try to block. And we do not need a standard operating procedure for how this works, because the goal there is to bind us to a very narrow set of rules and then constantly game those rules in terms of trying to find flaws so that you can do the one thing that the rules did not provide for, and constantly incapacitate us from defending public and private land. But it also came with a very problematic finding that all of this had to happen instantaneously. So we could only take these actions if you instantly prevent it. So what happens with a land invasion, like at the Tygerberg Raceway, is that you get there on day one and the first structures are built inside. You then demolish those structures. You are returning to land invasions in 2 or 3 other places. The situation becomes extremely violent. Our soft vehicles are smashed up. Our hardened vehicles are busy with land invasions in other parts of the city. And so it becomes extremely difficult to remove anything, because what we then saw arising very prominently is the practice of dressing structures. So I saw this personally in Witsands, where a bunch of new structures, informal structures, were erected, and these structures were unoccupied. Inside the structures, the grass is still 30 centimeters high. And in some structures, then you've had an attempt to make the structure look occupied. So you have 2 milk crates with a piece of foam bed across it and a sheet draped across that. So it looks like a bed, but if you press in the middle of it, there's nothing to sustain it. So the appearance of a bed collapses. There are suitcases placed, but the suitcases are empty. So an attempt is made at creating the ostensible or the appearance of occupation, so that the city is precluded from removing these structures. And so every rule is gamed. And where people who shack farm, there are people who actively drive this. There have been many media interviews with it. This is not my conjecture. I have encountered these individuals in Imizamo Yetu, in Hout Bay and elsewhere, who charge extortionate rates, build structures, bully people out of their structures, take it over, then let it again to other persons, including to foreign nationals, and are completely mercenary about how they conduct themselves, including allegedly committing murders and serious violent crime, in terms of intimidation and otherwise, if anybody speaks up. And these so-called shack farmers or land invasion facilitators will charge people 5,000, 2,000, I've heard of amounts up to 15,000 being charged for an, in quotes, home, where they then facilitate the panels and stuff being carried sometimes in the middle of the night. I can show you our eye in the sky footage with the thermal cameras, tracking people carrying sets of building materials in the middle of the night so that we can't find them in completely densely vegetated areas to go and build the structures, so that come morning the structures are nominally standing and can be used or can then be occupied. So you have people constantly advocating and working in the interest of the land invaders and gaming every weakness in the system to ensure that the land invaders are able to occupy public and private land. And that the entire underpinnings of this entire crisis in South Africa is the political and legal cowardice of the National Governing Party, who have been unable to have clear thinking legislation that spells out a clear set of executable and practical and operationalizable rules around this that are reasonable and do not impose an unreasonable burden of defense on public and private landowners. It cannot be that you leave your land untended for a few hours, come back and find a structure erected and may not counter-spoliate that structure, and then have to spend a year or two in court. And in the case of the city, and in the case of many private landowners, where the city is then cited as a respondent, before we may then apply for that eviction application, we have to offer the occupiers alternative accommodation. So now we have to offer accommodation to all these persons. And what you are really doing by that is incentivizing more people to queue jump, to occupy land illegally, to deny legitimate beneficiaries on waiting lists the chances of getting homes. And you're incentivizing land invasions and violent land invasions. Because if the city will take reasonable steps to stop land from being occupied, we are then met with unreasonable levels of violence, including attempts at immolating our staff with petrol bombs. And then if we respond with proportionate measures of violence, we are then very rapidly accused and interdicted and taken to court and staff members charged, etc. So it is a completely untenable situation, and the heart of that untenable situation created by this broken piece of national legislation called the PI Act.
It seems the PI Act worked a little bit too well. Today in South Africa, land invaders are better protected than the property owner. If there's a structure, you're not allowed to take it down, especially if there's evidence that someone lives in it. You're told to act immediately, but also you can't. You need a court order. You have to provide alternative accommodation, and all of that costs time and money, and a lot of it. And then there are groups, the ones who help coordinate these occupations. I wanted to find out more, to hear from someone on the ground, someone who's walked through informal settlements, who works with communities affected by housing delays and land grabs, and who advocates for people still waiting, often for years, on the housing list. For her safety, she asked to remain anonymous. So for this documentary, we'll call her Daisy. Here's what Daisy had to say about the raceway.
The Tygerberg Racecourse invasion was actually a result of the Blue Combos eviction that took place. We spoke to some of those people, and according to that group, they used to get their water from the racetrack facilities, and apparently they said they got permission from the city officials to go and live there. But the ward councillor denied that they got permission from them. What is very, very strange also is the fact that a particular land was earmarked for social housing development.
I asked the city about these allegations towards them, that they might be involved or were involved in the land grab that happened on the raceway. Here's what they had to say. The city obtained a court order on the 31st of July 2020 as soon as it became aware of the initial invasion. The order was meant to prevent any further invasions with SAP's assistance, but wasn't effective. Resources were limited during COVID-19 lockdown. That's their version. But I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, especially about the raceway being earmarked for housing. How easy is it for the public, or anyone else for that matter, to find out if a piece of land is earmarked for housing?
Before we start building, the public participation processes, the impact assessments, the EIAs, and otherwise, the processes in the budgeting, which generally is a 12 to 24 month exercise, and can be in some cases 4 or 5 years of preparatory work, planning work, etc. All of those have an endless number of people who have eyes on it. And certainly that site, the Tygerberg Raceway, was known that there were processes underway to look at that site. It's also become clear that certain politicians, councillors and support staff were weaponizing the city's own database systems against us. So there are records which they have access to, which in the past maybe did not come with levels of confidentiality, classification, etc. We're an open and transparent city. We have an open data policy, but where the councillors have access to the GIS system of the city. And while that is publicly accessible, the publicly accessible version is limited to the data it can see. The intranet version would allow and did allow councillors to go do searches on these available property holdings, print out potentially maps of where they were, and we could see that this was being done.
Within the city, there is a department called Informal Settlements Department. These officials is in control of these informal settlements, and they create informal settlements. I can tell you that the land grabs, it is predominantly people not born in the Western Cape, because we saw how they've been bussed in, and then you get from our poor colored people that have nowhere to go, and then there's always a committee that they need to speak to that is actually selling a plot for 5,000 or whatever to them, and then they have to pay it off like a monthly rent. And if they don't pay these monies, then they are being evicted unlawfully. All spheres of government, and especially the ruling parties, is involved in this shack farming. So it is a clear indication that there is a syndicate within the city that is giving permission to certain groups. And this is what how the city use our vulnerable people to create informal settlements to escape building houses. They are really the creators of these inhumane living conditions.
Once again, I asked the city about the general allegations that they might be behind land grabs or land invasions in general, and here's what they had to say. The city is not aware of any allegations. Residents are encouraged to report all allegations for investigation. Basically, they're saying we can neither confirm nor deny, but let us know if you hear anything. So I took it further. I reached out to DA spokesperson on human settlements in the Portfolio Committee. What does he make of the claims that a syndicate could be behind these invasions, possibly even within the city?
All right, my name is Luyolo Mphithi. I am the spokesperson on the Human Settlements Portfolio Committee in Parliament from the Democratic Alliance. You know, for the past couple of years, we've been dealing with the construction mafia across the country, and it really is in every form, shape in our municipalities, provinces, national, where you have these construction mafias who infiltrate projects and tender for projects, and when they don't get them, will hold the municipality or the city hostage for the fact that they did not receive that project. And then this is where you then find unlawful occupations taking place.
The construction mafia has undeniably been a problem for the city. Could some officials be working with them? It's not out of the realm of possibility. There's no question that gangsters and mafias are involved in land grabs, whether they're extorting property owners for protection or facilitating shack farming for profit. And you'd think politicians would rally behind people like Luyolo or the DA's efforts to stop these invasions. Sadly, they don't.
In most communities where projects are being brought to the community, there's community participation that needs to take place. When the project is being brought to the community, the councillor together with the municipality would meet with the community to, bring the project forth. And then people have expectations of jobs, expectations of, when will they get houses? And this is because people have been waiting for houses since 1996, and people have not received those houses. And so there is a lot of tension on the ground when it comes to these particular issues. And what then tends to happen is that you have political mercenaries that essentially hijack the emotions of community members to then invade land. We've seen numerous political parties like the EFF make calls to South Africans to invade land. I mean, just last week, the member from Marshall Dlamini from the EFF made a call to South Africans in his rally to say, invade land unlawfully.
The message is clear. When you see any unoccupied land, go and occupy that land until all our land has been returned back to the owners of our land.
Where we should put our energies, where parties like the EFF should be putting their energies, is on holding the Department of Human Settlements to account for the corruption that it has done throughout all these years, for the corruption that continues to happen in situations like the Housing Development Agency, the National Housing Financial Corporation, those institutions where we've seen gross financial mismanagement over a long period of time have remained unchecked. And that is where organizations like that should focus their attention, because that is where the crisis is.
That includes not just the EFF, but also the NCC, the National Colored Congress, and others who participate in land invasions, try and stop the city from acting on land invasions, intimidate our staff, lead violent protests against the city staff. And there is a very unfortunate thing that happens around election time. Your protest action increases dramatically because political parties desire relevance and then start protesting in order as one form of political activity to secure media attention, social media posts, and relevance. And a particularly problematic dynamic that emerges is the contestation within, for instance, the ANC and the EFF for the nomination for a particular ward. So it's not that the fight is between the ANC and the DA. It's that within the ANC, aspirant candidates are vying for prominence and using land invasions and their ability to facilitate a land invasion as a means of securing support for themselves in firstly securing the nomination and then later winning the ward. You know, the EFF will say, oh, every land invasion is a victory. No, it is not. You are condemning the persons on that land in perpetuity to high risk of flooding, fire, a lack of services, a lack of waste removal, because none of those things can be done once the structure is built.
One is staying there. This is race course, where the racing was. I don't know how you survive there. I don't know how you sleep there, deep inside the water. No, man.
A land invasion is per definition unplanned, therefore without services. It is almost impossible to add those services afterwards. And they are subject to incredibly high levels of vandalism constantly and illegal connections, etc. So service delivery becomes unsustainable and untenable. So every land invasion is just high levels of crime for the people who live in there. Ask the occupants of Marikana. High levels of fire and flooding, disasters that become unavoidable and unpreventable under those circumstances, with structures not being built with adequate fire breaks, not having access to underground services. You have to lift the structures to put in the underground services, and nobody is willing to lift the structures. And it's not just me who thinks it's broken. Anybody who's applied their mind in any reasonable way will tell you it's broken.
It is broken. Chris is a tax-paying, law-abiding citizen, a contributor to society. And yet his property was taken from him. He wasn't evicted by the courts, not by the state, but by land invaders. And here's the twisted part. If Chris wants to remove them from his land, the law says that he must find them alternative accommodation. A man is forcefully removed from his own property, and he's the one expected to provide housing for the people who kicked him out. Everyone shrugs, points fingers, blames everyone else. But no one restores what he lost. No one gives him his life back. Because in South Africa, under the PI Act, it's perfectly legal for someone to evict you, but you can't evict them. So what can be done? Are there any solutions to this PI Act? Why haven't politicians done anything? Well, some have. The Democratic Alliance has tried to push through amendments to the PI Act.
Yes, there are amendments to the PI Act that have been proposed by the Democratic Alliance in Parliament. One of the first things that the amendments that we've proposed aim to do is to criminalize individuals or groups who incite community members to unlawfully occupy land. We also make an amendment in the bill to say that we need to increase the amount of the sentence that someone can serve for inciting land invasions. So what we've put there is that we want it to be 3 years. We need to be able to balance the need for South Africans to be able to receive shelter, but also balance that with the rule of law, which is ensuring that unlawful occupations are criminalized and that people do serve sentences for that criminal activity. We also propose in the amendments, it should not only be the responsibility of municipalities to find temporary accommodation, it should be all spheres of government, including provincial and national government. And so we want to expand that particular definition. The second part of the amendments also focus on how do we expand the definitions in which the court considers when they are about to give a ruling for an eviction. And so there's a number of points that we make there, that we need to look at the person's financial standing, the person who's illegally occupied. We need to look at various reasons in which to expand the definition of an eviction, because as it stands, we do find that the PI Act has a very limited scope in which an eviction order is given. And so it is important for us to be able to see where exactly the various definitions can be expanded in order to grant evictions orders much easier. But this also speaks to property owners as well, who are also dealing with people who, for example, don't want to leave their properties, entered their properties in good faith, and now refuse to leave, and they are now protected by the PI Act. So we do think it's fundamentally important to balance the conditions in which an eviction order is given with the human right aspect of dignity as it pertains to people who are without shelter, because that, as is expressed in Section 26 of the Constitution, that it's a progressive realization that the state should ensure that everybody has a right to housing.
Wait, does Section 26 really say that? That everyone deserves a house? Now, there was a major court case that directly addressed this section, Government of the Republic of South Africa versus Grootboom, and it has shaped how our courts interpret this right ever since. The case involved Irene Grootboom and hundreds of others who were living in dangerous, overcrowded, informal conditions. After they were evicted from private land they tried to occupy, they were left homeless, sleeping under plastic sheets. They asked the courts, what happens when you have nowhere to go and the state does nothing? The Constitutional Court made it clear. Section 26 doesn't guarantee a house for everyone overnight, but it does require the government to take real responsible steps within its resources to improve access to housing over time, what the Constitution calls progressive realization. The court didn't order that everyone gets a brick house immediately, but it did say this. The Constitution demands more than promises, it demands action, especially for people in desperate need. The Grootboom case became a cornerstone in our law. It clarified that Section 26 is about more than long-term plans or waiting lists. It's about dignity, urgency, and holding the state accountable. Before we continue, it's important to make the following clear. What you're about to hear is Martin van Staden's personal interpretation of Section 26 of the Constitution. While he's a respected legal expert, this does not represent the official interpretation of the law by the Constitutional Court. The courts may see it differently, and what Martin offers here is his opinion, not a ruling.
So Section 26 cannot be considered in isolation from the rest of the Constitution. You have to see that it comes after Section 25, which is the right to property. And when provision like Section 26 refers to housing, it uses the word housing, it uses the word home, and of course it uses the word their home, in fact referring to their property. There is an implication of incorporating the basis of property that we have already established in Section 25, which is South Africans' right to private property. So Section 26 cannot be seen outside of this light. And unfortunately, increasingly in South Africa, and this has been normal for many years, but it's becoming far more radical, is that there is an attempt to decouple these things, certainly by the activists who are very involved in this controversy, but also by the courts, to be honest. This idea that someone can have a home, can have a piece of fixed property on the property of someone else, which any property lawyer would immediately be able to tell you that is not possible. If you own property, you can lease a piece of that property to someone else, and that's called a limited real right. But that domain is yours. It is your property, and someone else cannot have an ownership right in your unencumbered ownership right. And that's one of the issues that we see in South Africa, that we see from desperately poor people who are not to blame. Not everyone is a lawyer or a jurist, but people who have this idea that they can go onto the property of someone else or of the state to build a structure on that private property, and then to say, this is mine. This is my property, and I have an entitlement to stay here until the state provides me with a house of my own. That is becoming an increasingly common perspective amongst many poor South Africans, encouraged by this reckless socialist intelligentsia at last. But Section 26 must be seen for what it is. It is a constitutional right. What is a constitutional right? It is a protection from state predation. It is a protection from coercion of the state and coercion by others. But what is a constitutional right not? It is not an entitlement to freebies and goodies. And nothing in Section 26 really gives us the impression that that is what it is. The provision does not say that the state must provide housing to South Africans. The provision does not say that you must be provided with housing or that everyone must be provided with housing. It says that everyone has the right to have access to housing. That is not the same as saying that you will be provided with a piece of infrastructure. That is very much framed in what I would consider to be the terminology of a negative right. To say, as the Constitutional Court did acknowledge, at least in part, certainly not enough, but in part, in its Grootboom judgment, to say that in this right, there is the negative right, which says that this is a protection against you being put out of your house. Because why? The Constitution was adopted after a century more of state action that went into people's privately owned homes and evicted them from those homes and sent them to the native reserves, to the homelands, kicked and demolished those houses in many respects, and then brought in another population group to live in that area. That is the political context in which Section 26 of the Constitution was adopted, to say that we're done with that. We're no longer going to allow the state to go onto people's property and to kick them out and put them elsewhere. If that is your property, if that is your home, then you must be secure in it. Your home is your castle. You may live there unmolested by the authorities, and certainly you may not be kicked out by criminals, even other civilians. And this is where this modern day perversion comes in. So unfortunately, we've had this process whereby the legal intelligentsia and unfortunately the courts have reconceptualized a constitutional right to operate in the 180-degree opposite direction than it is supposed to be operating. It is supposed to protect people's spaces against invasion. And in fact, it has been used to encourage, to enable invasion of people's owned and personal spaces.
All right, now that we know what the Constitution says, let's get back to Luyolo.
We're also saying that, the process of getting an eviction order in court is quite a strenuous process. When a municipality sees illegal invasions, they will rather not take it to court because of the financial implications of taking it to court. And we all know that if people have invaded land, there is a responsibility to ensure that there's sanitation, electrification, and the like. And so we need to understand that all these things add up. And if we don't find a way to stop these invasions, we will have a bigger problem in this country than what we actually have right now. We've seen in the past couple of years an increase in land invasions, unlawful occupations. There are people who are behind these land invasions. There are people who are taking private property by force. There are people who are taking state land by force. There are people who are taking land earmarked for progress, for housing, for the fulfillment of Section 26 by force. And we are simply saying those people need to face the might of the law. And so where the bill is right now is that on the 28th of May, it will serve in the Portfolio Committee, where it will be tested for desirability. And in essence, this is where the DA will make its case, together with the amendments that we are proposing on the Act to the Portfolio Committee, where there will be discussions amongst Portfolio Committee members who, of course, represent different political parties, where they'll be able to question and comment and also be able to add any amendments that they want. And based on the support of the committee, and that needs to be in majority, will then the Act move forward in the parliamentary process.
On the 28th of May 2025, the Democratic Alliance presented their private members' bill to amend the PI Act to Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Human Settlements. Surprisingly, the Department of Human Settlements supported many of the DA's proposals. They've now committed to a full review of the PI Act and plan to table their own amendment bill by March 2026. Another political party offering a solution is the Referendum Party. But unlike the DA, they're not pushing for a national reform. They're taking a provincial route, aiming to repeal and replace the PI Act only in the Western Cape.
Okay, so my name is Robert King, and I am on the executive committee of the Referendum Party, and I was our lead candidate in the 2024 elections. So let me just give some background on the illegal settlement issue in South Africa, and particularly the Western Cape, to start off with. So prior to the PI Act in the 1990s, a lot of this was based on apartheid era legislation. So we had something called, I believe, the Prevention of Legal Squatting Act that was in place. And this criminalised illegal land invasions almost in its entirety. So if you didn't own the land and you put up a dwelling on that property, you could be evicted without a court order. Now, obviously, this is a complicated matter, and you do have vulnerable people and you do have complexities there. So there were people who implemented the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act in the mid-1990s to provide protections to people living on these lands. And while it was, good intentioned, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And we've seen in the Western Cape as a result now, certainly in the last few decades, we've seen an escalation in the number of illegal land invasions taking place. And what we're saying primarily, the main focus with our legislation is redefining what a home is. And it focuses on prior consent that existed when that dwelling was set up. So if you put your dwelling on a property and you had no permission to do so, then at no point can that be considered a home. And as a result, the protections in place for you fall away under the PI Act. And municipalities are given this mandate to find alternative accommodation. Now, we want to redefine that so it's more, there isn't that requirement to give alternative accommodation if they never had permission in the first place. So that's one change. We also want to take inspiration from things like the DA's bill to criminalise incitement to invade land or form illegal settlements. So those are some of the areas where the Referendum Party's bill aims to improve the situation in the Western Cape. And look, at the end of the day, we're not going back to the pre-1994 system. So you've still, or the pre-1996 system, I think it was, you've still got a court process that needs to be taken into consideration. Even though the bill seeks to limit where alternative accommodation can be provided, because it doesn't make sense to give it to everyone, it still allows for alternative accommodation to be provided in certain circumstances. And I think that's actually the best way to go about it, is looking at the people who are vulnerable and giving it in those situations. But I believe that's not the case in the vast majority of cases. And indeed, another area of the bill that we hope will improve the situation is it will lead to expedited evictions in areas where there's a clear environmental or public safety risk. So that includes railway lines, wetlands, nature reserves. So in those areas, it will actually put us in a stronger position to advance those evictions. And it should streamline those for court cases that are going through the courts. We also don't oppose the DA in their efforts at the national level to change this. If they can present these changes at the national level, do it. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be harder to make a change in a parliament where about 2/3 of the members or more are communists that actually agree with land invaders, than it's going to be in a parliament where the DA actually already holds a majority. But the important thing you have to remember when it comes to housing policy is it's a legislative authority that's concurrent between a national and provincial government. So provincial governments and provincial parliaments have a right to make changes to housing policy in the Western Cape. And what we're saying is, look, you might have to make lots of compromises at the national level with people who fundamentally don't want to see any changes on this. The DA is going to have to make a choice. Are they going to continue to go along the same old path where they allow illegal land invasions to continue because they're almost afraid to take advantage of their position in the provincial parliament to present legislation? Or are they going to be bold and actually agree with this bill, pass it, and make it law in the Western Cape? And I can tell you, I think it will be a very interesting debate that's going to unfold when that happens, not just outside of the DA and the general public, but within the DA as well, because we've got a lot of people in the DA who actually support us on this endeavour. In order to have a society or a civilization or a country that's going to be successful, that's going to be one which you can leave to your children and your grandchildren, you need to have that respect for property rights there. Otherwise, we've seen with Zimbabwe, we've seen with large parts of the world, when that doesn't exist, everything else falls apart. And when it comes to property rights, we need to start going on to the offensive with it. And when it comes to our illegal settlements bill, This is an opportunity in the Western Cape to turn the tide on property rights, to start going on the offensive. And if we can score a win here, if we can put pressure on the politicians, not in Pretoria, but in Cape Town, to accept this bill, we can start turning the tide, we can start making a change in the Western Cape. And then once we've got that momentum, we can start winning in other areas as well. So we can look at the expropriation bill, see what opportunities there are. We can look at other concurrent areas of policy in the Western Cape Parliament and see where can we take power back from Pretoria. And we can actually start to build a future in the Western Cape that serves the people here, not the insane ideological political endeavours of Marxist politicians in the union buildings.
Insane socialist ideology. That's not an exaggeration. And while I'm glad to see parties fighting to amend or replace the PI Act, I can't help but wonder, is it too late? What solutions are left for the raceway? When I asked the city if they had a resolution in place or a plan to fix the situation, here's what they had to say. There's no formal, legal, or developmental plans currently underway. The Informal Settlements Department is exploring options, either to acquire new land to relocate the occupiers or to incrementally upgrade the current settlement. But no decision has been taken. It's been 5 years. If you haven't found a solution to the raceway yet, you're not gonna find a solution. And across the country, land invasions are happening again and again, but I don't think people fully understand what is really being lost. When I look back at the raceway, it's not just about land. It's about a community, a history, a passion. Gary Fleming, a veteran motorsport commentator, helped put that loss into perspective, not just for racing fans, but for South Africa as a whole.
Gary Fleming, and pretty much involved with motorsport all the years from a commentary point of view, and I have my own live show that I do on Facebook on Motorsport once a week as well, in the latter years. Well, there's actually two great losses. One was the biggest, most modern oval track motorsport facility at that point in South Africa, is the one side of it, and the other side is what the local community lost in terms of income, because every time that you have a race meeting, everybody scores in the nearby area, from accommodation through food, through alcohol, through petrol, through everything. And it goes even further than that, because if you don't have a decent facility, people won't build racing cars. If you've got a great facility and people love it, they'll end up spending money building a racing car. So the financial implications is just a portion of losing the best circuit, arguably ever, in South Africa in terms of oval track racing. There was lots of youngsters. A lot of the youngsters that started at Tygerberg Raceway are the stars of not only oval track, but main circuit racing today. You've got to start somewhere to get into motorsport, and a lot of the people that start in oval track racing stay with oval. A lot of people that start with oval track racing, because that's where they can afford to get in, migrate to main circuit racing, which is another multi-million rand industry in its own right. You've got to have the grassroots. Our grassroots is not there anymore, and it's affecting the sport as a whole. You have to have that basis to bring the kids, the family side of it as well. The whole place is marketed from a family point of view, family entertainment. We had a national meeting the one year that we said to people before the time, make sure you come early. You can only accommodate so many people and no more. That the fire department eventually said, you cannot let any more people into the ground, because if something happens, a car catches a light in this parking area, what have you, there's just too much congestion, you can't get everybody in and out. They would actually close the gates, that people parked in the roadway outside, and they were allowed to walk in, and they stood between the grandstands to come and watch. That's the level that we were at when everything came to an end. So it wasn't what it could be, it was already. It could have gone even bigger than what it was. If we just build more grandstands and have bigger parking areas and bigger access roads, more caterers, it was all there to be had. So what's happening now is the wealth that was being brought from out of town into Cape Town environment It's now being spent on people going to Worcester and to Saldanha. And that traveling is also very, very expensive. And that is causing that we've got dwindling numbers at this stage of the fight in the sport. We need a track in Cape Town again. We need a top facility in Cape Town to keep that wealth in Cape Town, to keep that wealth in our municipalities. And then also, once you've got that, you'll once again get into that cycle of let's build a racing car. That's a whole industry on its own, which also gives people employment, which is a dying concern at the moment now because we don't have a racetrack.
If you go through all the towns, take Cape Town, say Kraaifontein, he's got a rugby field, he's got a soccer field, he's got tennis fields. Who built it? The city. You go to Brackenfell, soccer field, rugby field. Everyone gets fields from the city. Why not Motorsport? They can just give us one racetrack in Cape Town. Give us one facility for spinning, for oval track, for drags. We must build it out of our own pockets. Then we must build our own cars, cost us 500 to $1 million a car. And me, Chris Liebenberg, must bring the people from overseas to compete, to get Springbok colors. But when I do that, I must put on the newspaper, South Africa. I can't say Chris Liebenberg. I must say South Africa against USA, against UK. But I get no help, not 1 cent from the city, of the government. But if they bring the All Blacks or any other team, if it's soccer, rugby, tennis, call it, who paid for that? The city, of the government. But Motorsport, we must do it out of our own pockets. Why? Why must we treat different against other sports? Why? It's not right in my eyes.
There is no comparison anywhere in South Africa to what Tygerberg Raceway was. Nobody's been able to build. There are some good circuits. There's one very good one in Bloemfontein, in fact, where they are trying to build another Tygerberg Raceway in terms of stands and embankments and pit area sizes and sound systems and what have you. But it's just not there anymore, unfortunately. So it's a dying sport right now. It's not in good form at all. If we could build 3 decent circuits spread out around South Africa and have proper facilities, you'd have a boom in car building and prep and maintenance and what have you, which is a whole industry in its own right. It employs so many people. There's a lot of people that are now unemployed because of the motorsport industry in the situation that it's at.
What South Africa has lost because of this land invasion is greater than a raceway. It's a loss of community, opportunity, and justice. And what's worse, nothing's been done to make it right. The Tygerberg Raceway invasion wasn't a simple case of people looking for land. It was a perfect storm. COVID-19 lockdowns that froze evictions, a crippled court system, police with their hands tied, and worst of all, a piece of legislation called the PI Act. An act that claims to protect the vulnerable, but ends up protecting land invaders while punishing law-abiding property owners. And now the Expropriation Act has been signed into law, giving government sweeping powers to seize land under vague terms like public interest. What stops them from looking at a place like this, declaring it inhumane and taking it? No compensation, no accountability. The act gives a few reasons for expropriation without compensation, but there's a part there that says it's not limited to these reasons. That should terrify every property owner in this country. I'm not saying the government will do it, I'm saying they can, and that's a problem. While South Africans argue whether or not the Expropriation Act erodes private property, land invasions are already happening. Quietly, strategically, and not like Zimbabwe. Not yet, anyway, but the erosion has already begun. So who's to blame? In my opinion, the ANC. They introduced the PI Act, they allowed it to be twisted and weaponized, and they gave gangsters, syndicates, and corrupt officials the legal silence to do the dirty work. And with the help of broken laws and silent institutions, the PI Act protects invaders. The Expropriation Act empowers the state, and the property owner left defenseless. They didn't need to seize your land, they gave someone else permission to take it. If this can happen to Chris, what makes you think it won't happen to you? This is how freedom dies, not with bulldozers, but with silence. How long until they come for your land?